Hello! Here's a theodicy I developed that answers the problem of evil in the least satisfying way possible. This theodicy is going to be built on the assumption that utilitarianism is true. Utilitarianism is, roughly speaking, the theory that morality can be reduced to the maximization of utility. Any and all actions are good insofar as they increase utility. Utility, for our purposes, is the value that you get when you add up the pleasure everyone experiences and subtract the pain that everyone experiences. So, shooting someone in the face is bad because it causes more pain than pleasure. Going through a dental procedure is good because, even though it may cause more pain in the short term, it relieves more pain in the long run. Now, even if you have problems with this kind of moral theory, we're assuming that it's true for our present purposes. Now, God is a being who is perfectly rational and perfectly moral. Since we've assumed utilitarianism, the fact that he's perfectly moral means that he's going to be the kind of being that, when faced with two alternatives, will always opt for the one which yields the most utility.
Hold on, Squared. So far, this looks like an argument against God more than an actual theodicy. The real world is full of many things which cause suffering. However, God could have made a pleasure world where humans never feel pain, and he in some way pumps them all full of pleasure constantly for all eternity. Wouldn't a God who followed utilitarianism obviously prefer that other world?
Well, that's the annoying part of the theodicy. Utilitarianism has almost the exact opposite effect from what we would expect to have on God's decision-making process. Allow me to explain. First, utilitarianism is based on performing actions which maximize utility. So we need to ask what actions are available to God. Well, God, being very different from us, has to choose not individual ways of exercising his power, but which possible world to actualize. So God considers the utility contained in each possible world, and chooses which world to actualize based off of that consideration. Now, what this theodicy maintains is that either the total utility in the real world actually equals the total utility in the pleasure world, or the total utility in the real world is indeed less than the total utility of the pleasure world, but due to some other complicated considerations, that doesn't actually matter. God may very well actualize it nonetheless. Let's start off by considering this first route. The total utility of the pleasure world is equal to, well, infinity, because you have creatures experiencing some level of happiness multiplied by the infinite duration of their happiness. Now, the total utility of the real world is equal to the total pleasure in the real world, which is also infinity because of heaven, minus the finite pain here on Earth. Infinity minus some finite value equals infinity, so the total utility in the real world is still infinity. So the real world has infinite utility, and the pleasure world has infinite utility. Thus, from a utilitarian perspective, these worlds are equally good. Certain versions of hell do complicate this, because then there would be infinite suffering as well, but I think that a final value of infinite utility can still be maintained if one holds that for any moment in the afterlife, the amount of pleasure being experienced is much greater than the amount of pain being experienced. Moving on, when God decides which world to create, he can't actually have any moral preference for one world over the other, because they have equal utility. So which world God ends up creating is ultimately going to be a product purely of his free will. That seems really weird, but this kind of paradoxical conclusion crops up in other considerations about infinity. For example, say I have infinity cards, each with a natural number written on it. Then I go through the set and duplicate it by copying each number onto another card, but after each copy I add a 0 to the end. These two sets seem to be equal in size. But what if I go and remove from my original set every number that doesn't end with a 0? Well, it seems that I just made my original set smaller. But actually, now the two sets are completely identical. This kind of paradox, of one infinitely large thing looking smaller than another infinitely large thing, while nonetheless the two infinities are the same size, crops up all over the place. A defender of this theodicy could just maintain that one more place it crops up is a utilitarian assessment of our world as opposed to another world. But maybe you think that doesn't work. Maybe you think it is nonetheless possible to assess whether some worlds are better or worse than others, despite the already mentioned worries about infinity. Well, it turns out that even if this is true, the theodicy can still work. Let's imagine all worlds ordered on a line, from worlds containing the least amount of utility to worlds containing the most amount of utility. Now, is there some best world at the end of this line? It doesn't seem so. We could always add one more person experiencing never-ending joy to get an even better world. So the line goes on forever with better and better worlds. Thus, trying to choose the best world is like trying to choose the largest integer. For any n, n plus 1 is always larger. For any world, there is always a better one. But if that's all true, how is God supposed to decide which world to actually create? Or what if he wanted to choose the largest integer? Well, since there is no best world and no largest integer, God's decision of which world to create or which number to say will need to ultimately be up to his free will. This has a really interesting consequence. Imagine you ask God to tell you the largest integer. He would explain that this task is impossible. You ask God to give an answer anyways, and just choose a really large integer or something. He says 3. You may think that God has done a very poor job of choosing a large integer. So God asks you, well, what did you expect? To which you respond, I don't know, a big number, like Googleplex or something. Now, the thing is, God already knows that there are better answers that he could have given. In fact, there are infinity way better answers that he could have given. However, this is also true of the Googleplex. There are infinity answers which would have been way better than a Googleplex. So while God sees that 3 is indeed a silly answer in some way, a Googleplex looks silly to God too. In fact, in God's infinite knowledge, where he is directly acquainted with every integer, he knows that for every integer n, there are infinity answers which are way better than n. So all answers seem silly to God. He knows all the numbers so well that none of them are large to him. The human mind works differently though. We encounter the number 3 a lot in our day-to-day lives, and we encounter a Googleplex very rarely. So to us, it seems that 3 is a silly answer, and a Googleplex is not a silly answer, even though that for this question, they are both silly answers. So returning to the question of which world God would create, the infinite ascension of better and better worlds forces God to make an arbitrary decision in some sense. So the world God ends up making may only have 3 small units of utility in total. But that's not the only quirky thing about God's choosing of which world to create. If we consider a world with 3 units of pleasure and 0 units of pain, then its overall utility is 3 units. But that's the same total utility as a world with 4 units of pleasure and 1 unit of pain. And that's the same total utility as a world with n plus 3 units of pleasure and n units of pain. So, in a utilitarian framework, a world with just some pleasure is as equally good as a world with lots of pain and just slightly more pleasure. Therefore, God would not prefer one of them to the other. Now, finally, where do all these considerations leave us? Well, as long as a world has more pleasure than pain, then there is a bona fide possibility that God would create that world. This allows us to answer the problem of evil. If a skeptic asks, why did God allow instance X of horrific suffering? Well, then one could answer, even though our world does include instance X of suffering, the total pleasure in our world outweighs the total pain. Thus, when God is considering which world to choose from a utilitarian perspective, our world was nonetheless a live option, and that's the option that God chose. Now, this is an incredibly unsatisfying answer to why God allows evil. The reason God allowed you to go through some pain, like stubbing your toe, may be that this pain was counterbalanced by the pleasure of some random person you never met enjoying their ice cream. These things have no direct connection, except that they happened in the same possible world. And the thing God needs to evaluate are worlds, not individual events in those worlds. And in the absence of a best possible world, God has to settle for a world which is less than the best.
Look, Squared, I cannot believe that you think that this theodicy is actually true. So what's the point of developing this theodicy at all?
Well, my point, besides it just being interesting, is that the problem of evil can be framed within a utilitarian mindset. XYZ brings more suffering than pleasure, so God would never allow it, and so on. My goal was to defeat the problem of evil from within the very same moral framework. I think that this theodicy should ultimately be rejected because the initial assumption of utilitarianism is faulty. But then any variation of the problem of evil that relies solely on utilitarian thinking should also be rejected. A good version of the problem of evil should be ultimately based in non-utilitarian reasoning. And insofar as non-utilitarian moral concepts are allowed into the discussion, the closer one gets to the Christian worldview. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are God's way of reconciling mankind to himself. This deals with concepts like sin, justice, righteousness, and so on. These are definitely not utilitarian in nature. So, the problem of evil must be formulated in a way that at least opens the door to Christian values. That's pretty cool. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe or support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.